shared early on that this series is really about my own inner journey and how I regularly struggle with doubt, and that I have to go through this process on a regular basis of making sure that faith still makes sense for me. And so I thought that something that might be good to do is bring you all along on that journey. And in case some of you struggle with doubts or have friends who struggle with doubts, maybe this could be a helpful path for you to walk out of them. Not that I think doubts are a bad thing. I think doubt and faith kind of go hand in hand. And so I think that, I don't expect in my own life to get rid of doubt. But when I'm facing doubts that are particularly concerning to me or that are really causing me a lot of angst, sometimes I need some paths to walk out to make sure that it really makes sense to believe in God and to believe in the Bible and to believe in Jesus. And so the first stop on that journey, because there's a few stops on that journey, do you mind turning me down just a little bit? It's just ringing slightly and distracting me. And I'm easily distracted. So thank you. The first stop on this journey that I go on is to figure out if it makes sense to believe in God, period. Does it make sense to believe that there's a divine being out there? Because there's a sense in our society that maybe it doesn't. Maybe the smartest people have figured out that God isn't real, and so we have to kind of, in order to keep pretending, if it helps us, then we just kind of have to close our eyes to the real evidence. And so the first thing I have to check is figure out if it would be better maybe for me to adopt a purely rational scientific worldview. And what I find out and what I shared about was that even if you adopt a purely rational scientific worldview, which there isn't really any such thing, okay? Science hasn't figured everything out. And so there's still huge gaps where you still have to take leaps of faith, especially when it comes to, well, what caused the Big Bang? If you accept there's a Big Bang, what caused that? Science has no good answers for that. And so you have to take a bit of a leap of faith there. How did life just miraculously is the wrong word, randomly, luckily, appear out of non-life? That's another thing that science doesn't have a great answer for, and you still have to do a little bit of a leap of faith. And so what I find when I chase that path down is, even if I were to adopt an atheistic worldview and say, I'm not going to include God at all, I still have to take leaps of faith, which seem to me to be almost as big as the ones I have to take, or maybe even bigger than the ones I have to take in believing in a God. The other thing that I talked about was the fact that there are actually good, logical, objective arguments that tilt the scales a little bit towards the existence of God. Not proof, not things that you can just show and nobody can question them because now you've proved there is a God, but arguments that say, you know what, it's not dumb to believe in God. In fact, it's actually kind of smart. And so we covered 3 of those arguments for the existence of God 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to go through them again. If you want to hear more about those or just about this first basic building step of why I think it's logical to believe in God, then you can go back and listen to it on YouTube. Or our podcast is now actually working again on iTunes, or you can go to our Facebook page, so you can see me in all kinds of media now. I'm very famous. Today, I'm going to assume that we have all made it through that mental journey, even though some of you weren't there, but that we've come to this assumption that, okay, I think it's logical to say there's some sort of a creator, some sort of a divine being or entity or substance or whatever that caused the universe, that created this world we live in. So we're accepting, beginning today, that God exists. And now the question is, what kind of God exists? What is he or she or it like? Now, I could take you to all kinds of Bible passages that would help us understand who God is. And normally that is actually how I would teach about who God is. But just for this series, we are stepping outside of the Bible. And we're actually looking for evidence in logic, reason, the world around us to say, what can we learn from that? And it's not because we don't believe the Bible. As a church, we base all of our beliefs on the Bible. It's our foundation. But here's the thing. I don't know if you've noticed this. Not everyone does believe the Bible today. And so if your only answer to anyone who asks you about the hope that you have inside of you is, well, I just believe it because the Bible says, you're not talking the same language. It's not going to mean anything to them. The days are long gone when society saw the Bible as any source of authority. And so if we're going to be able to have a conversation about our faith with the people around us, we need to be able to, if we can, point to some other things that might give evidence that what we read in here is true. And sometimes it's helpful to start with that. And I have had my thunder stolen today because I was going to start with a scripture, and I am going to start with a scripture just to kind of set the tone, and that is Romans 1:20, which Ingrid just read to you, and I will read to you again. So Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what was made, so that people are without excuse." Now, the reason that I bring up this verse is not just to say that you can see God in nature, which is true, but also to say that what we're doing is valid. That the Scriptures actually teach us that we can find God outside of the Scriptures. That people can look at the world around us and learn some stuff about God. This is traditionally called natural theology. It's theology or thinking about God that's built upon reason. Let's see, this was the definition. It's knowledge of God that is based on observed facts and experience apart from special divine revelation. It's something that dates back thousands of years. Ancient Greeks did this. And it's helpful for us today to be able to create bridges, to create language that makes sense to someone who hasn't already said, well, the Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it. Have you ever seen that bumper sticker? You guys didn't live in the States. That is a bumper sticker. Anyway, so let's start with a little discussion here, okay? So I want you to help me out here. Apart from the Bible, so nothing about what you learned in church or learned in the Bible, what can we deduce, what can we assume or think about God just simply from our observed universe and our experience of the world around us? What kind of things could you say about what God, assuming there is one, is like? Consistent. Creative. Detail-oriented. Artistic. Gracious. Generous. Do we have a voice of skepticism in here? Forgiveness. Confusing. Relentless. Mysterious. Powerful. Writing that Southern. Powerful. What? Merciful. Frustrating. Dangerous. I heard another one. Loving. Patient. Imaginative. I'm going to throw severe in here. I see a lot of severity in nature. And you know what? I'm going to throw indifferent in here. Because when I look at nature, I look at the way the world runs, sometimes I think if that's all I had to go on, I would think that God is kind of indifferent to it all. He's just kind of standing back, letting it happen. Absent. Challenging. Got room for one more. Humorous. Yes, I agree. I visited the zoo a few years ago, and I saw it through the eyes of who imagined all these things. And I thought, God has a sense of humor, especially when I saw the anteaters. Man, what a weird animal. Anyway, thank you. Now, here's the deal. Over the years, people have looked at the world that we live in and have come to very different conclusions about who God is and what he or she or it is like. And one of the first places that the world is divided is whether or not God or the divine being is personal or impersonal. So we're going to talk about that first. Now, when I talk about God being personal, I am talking about him being a person, but I'm not talking about him being a human being. I'm not talking about eyes, nose, mouth, but someone who has attributes of personhood, someone rather than something. If we think about all the different things that we have in our world and how we classify them, we have things like objects in this room, right? We have concepts in our heads. We have laws. We have animals. We have places. There's lots of different classifications for what we see in the world. And one of the classifications that we have is persons. Now, just so we don't get mixed up in thinking that we're just thinking about a human being, let's pretend we move to another planet and we travel to another planet and we look around us and we see everything looks strange and different, and some things are inanimate and there's some things that are moving and they look like they might be alive. How would we know if we were dealing with the thing that we call a person? What are the attributes of personhood? Help me out here again. You ever thought about this? I've got to think about this for a couple weeks, and I didn't come to a definite list, and so I thought, let's come up with a list together. What's that? Adapting, okay. So water adapts to whatever container you put it in. Is it a person? Yes, I'm gonna push back a little bit on this one. But no, I think that's good. What's that? Ability to reason, okay.
Free will.
Hold on. Free will. I heard, what was that? Emotion. Okay. Communication.
Opposable thumbs.
I'm not writing that one down, James. Opposable thumbs. I had a fish once that had opposable thumbs. Sorry. Compassion, okay. Compassion. Uh-oh. What's that? Consciousness. Sorry, I only pushed back on Jen so far. That was bad. And James. So. Loving. Yeah. So if someone wasn't very loving, they wouldn't be a person? Then we could kill them. Oh. Yes. Do you ever think dogs have emotions? I know mine has the emotion of guilt. When I walk in and she slinks off the couch, I'm like, if you knew you weren't supposed to do it, why did you do it? So she doesn't say anything back because she can't communicate. So, at least not in language. What else? Humorous. Creative. Fear. It's hard to nail down, isn't it? It's like some sort of strange combination of these things that, like, do other things have fear? Yes. Our hamster is often very creative, seemingly, in what he does with whatever we put in his cage. So, I guess what I'm saying is, sometimes it's kind of a combination here. So I don't have a solid answer, and when I Googled it, nobody else did either. It seems like a deep philosophical question that doesn't have a completely clear answer, but I think we start to get the picture of what it means to be a person rather than some sort of other object. And so the first question we really want to cover with regards to what kind of God we might expect, given that there is a God, is whether this God is something more like a person, some of those things we just listed there, or more like a substance, like air or water or something like that. Is God impersonal, not a person? So belief in an impersonal divine being is often called pantheism, which means God is pan meaning everything, or monism, which means everything is one reality, or non-dualism, which is the same as monism. And this is the idea that the universe and the divine being are actually the same reality. Okay, that everything we see around us in the world doesn't just represent God. God isn't just present with or in the whole universe, but that somehow God actually is the whole universe. So God is the tree, God is the lake, God is me, God is you. Some versions of Hinduism hold to this view, that sort of underlying everything that we see in the world is this idea of the absolute or Brahman, and that the goal of life then is simply to realize that oneness that we share with the whole universe and become one with this Brahman, this absolute. Some versions of Buddhism might stray a little bit towards an impersonal God, but most Buddhists do not believe in a creator, transcendent God at all. And so most Buddhists wouldn't sort of fall into this category, but there's a lot of different varieties of Buddhism. Pantheism basically says that we relate to God more like how we relate to air than how we relate to another person. That the divine kind of surrounds us. We breathe it in, it fills us up, we sense it, we experience its reality, we're sustained by it, but we don't build a relationship with it. We don't interact with it like we would with a friend or a lover. Now, according to my observation of Facebook posts nowadays, this kind of semi-impersonal view of God is growing in popularity. I often hear people talk about the universe in sort of a semi-godlike way. The universe, I'm putting it out there to the universe. The universe spoke back to me. Have you heard this sort of language? It's getting more and more popular these days, and I have a theory about why it's getting more and more popular. 2 words: the Force. A generation that was raised wanting to be Jedis is quite happy to trade in the outdated idea of a grumpy, bearded old man God in the sky for something that seems a lot more like the Force. Am I right? There's a certain attraction to that for our generation. Obi-Wan Kenobi described the Force this way: the Force is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us. It penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. Has both a light side and a dark side. This is, I see a lot of similarities to how people view God in sort of an impersonal way today. Of course, the Force can be harnessed and directed and used for good or evil, but the Force itself is neither good or evil. It just is. So this is not exactly parallel to pantheism, and I'm not sure anyone consciously adopts this, but I would bet that the influence of Star Wars has had a big influence on how we understand the divine being, okay? So now, the problem that I see with this impersonal view of God is that it leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and it doesn't necessarily hold together logically. So first, saying that God and the universe are one means that God is equal to everything in the universe. So that means God's not only the beautiful sunset, where we feel the warm fuzzies, but God is a child starving to death in Africa. So God is not only the love that we find in human relationships, but God is the woman being murdered and the murderer killing her. And so to say that God is equal to everything in the universe takes in a lot of reality, both good, beautiful realities that we can understand, but also awful, terrible realities. And I have a hard time understanding even sometimes how a good God would allow evil and suffering. And so to say that God is actually equated to evil and suffering is very difficult for me. That's not a helpful concept. The other thing that I see as problematic with this understanding of an impersonal or pantheistic God is this. If the universe and God are the same reality, are one, then do we say that the universe created itself? Is it a self-creating reality? And what does that even mean? Did the universe will itself into existence? Well, that doesn't make complete sense if it's an impersonal object. I'm not sure an impersonal object has free will or volition, as we call it. A waterfall doesn't decide to flow, right? Air doesn't decide to blow like wind. It just happens. It just is. It just flows. And so this view of a divine force as impersonal, it's hard to comprehend how it would decide to create a universe. And the obvious answer to that is, well, the universe always existed. God always existed. They were always this oneness. But the problem with that is that we discussed a couple weeks ago that the very best science that we have now, no matter which theory you turn to, they almost all include both a beginning and an end to the universe. So the universe we see as finite from our best scientific viewpoints. And so the idea of an eternal universe is not something that necessarily holds together. And so if God is the universe and the universe has a beginning and an end, does that mean that God has a beginning and an end? Or who put this God-universe oneness here to begin with? Was it a bigger God-universe oneness? So you don't have to really go too far along this path to start seeing, there's some logical problems with the idea of an impersonal God, a God that doesn't have free will or volition or the choice to create something. Let's see where on earth I am in my notes here. If the universe had a beginning, which I think it did, and if God is the eternal and uncaused cause that was behind the universe, then that means the universe is here because God decided it would be. He exercised will or volition in saying, or choice in saying, I want a universe. Otherwise, if God is equal to the universe, it doesn't make sense that that could happen. And therefore, why did the universe just spontaneously spring into existence? There had to be some sort of will behind it, in my mind. And so that's one step toward personhood, away from an impersonal view of God. The other thing is, it also seems like the divine being, whatever it was that created this world, has some level of intelligence, rationality, the ability to reason, to think. As we saw 2 weeks ago, this universe that we live in is an incredibly fine-tuned place. There are all these things that come together that are just right, tuned up just exactly the way they need to be in order to allow life on planet Earth. And that saying that was just a really lucky break is not as good an answer as saying, well, it looks like someone actually designed it to be this way. So if we can accept the fact that the universe had a designer, then we need to understand that this thing, this power behind the universe had something like intelligence, something like reason, something like rationality, the ability to think, the ability to fine-tune things. And so we look at the kind of universe we live in and we say, well, God must have had some sort of intelligence, something like an engineer, a very precise, analytical, detail-oriented intelligence. But then we also look around and we go, well, it's not just like an engineer. Whatever this divine force was, is also kind of like an artist. Look at the incredible variety, the creativity that we see, the beauty. And of course, a non-theist would just say, well, that was all a lucky result of evolutionary processes. But we're assuming here now that we have a God. And once we've accepted the fact that there's a God, then we look at the beauty not just as lucky breaks, but as some sort of expression of his volition or will. And what we see is this incredible beauty and creativity. And so we say, so maybe this divine being, has will, has volition, maybe intelligence, rationality, and creativity, imagination. And so we're moving a lot closer to a personal view of God, something less like air or water and something more like us. So now, G.K. Chesterton wrote an incredible book called Orthodoxy about his coming to faith several years ago, like several decades ago. And if you want a good book, that would be a good one to pick up. But here's a little quote out of that book. G.K. Chesterton said, "I had always vaguely felt facts to be miracles in the sense that they were wonderful. Now I began to think them miracles in the stricter sense that they were willful." In other words, that God had chosen them. "I mean that they were or might be repeated exercises of some will In short, I had always believed that the world involved magic. Now I thought that perhaps it involved a magician. And this pointed to a profound emotion, always present and subconscious, that this world of ours has some purpose. And if there is a purpose, there is a person. I'd always felt life first as a story. And if there is a story, there is a storyteller. So, I thought it was just a beautiful quote, so I thought I'd share that with you. It's kind of that journey from what do we see in the world, who do we think, or what do we think is behind it all. Now, since I blamed the new popularity of the impersonal view of God on Star Wars, now let me use it for good, like a good Jedi Knight would. George Lucas created the Star Wars world. It began as an idea in his mind and grew from there. He exercised his will to write a screenplay. He used his power to actually create the movies. And many people have had the opportunity to figuratively journey into this world that he created and be touched by it. I'm sure that if you were to analyze the environments he created, the plot lines, the characters, that you would probably be able to learn something about George Lucas and who he was and what was important to him. But you would never say that George Lucas is Star Wars, not literally at least, right? Star Wars is his creation. Star Wars is dependent on him, was dependent on him to bring it into existence. But George Lucas and Star Wars are not the same thing. Even if he were to write himself as a character into Star Wars, and suddenly George Lucas becomes the hero of the whole story from beginning to end, and it all wraps up with him being king of the universe. Even if he were to do that, he would still not be equated to this Star Wars world that he had brought into being, right? You understand that, right? An artist is not the same as their artwork, even though you can see glimpses of them through it. And so I think that's the best way to understand whatever this creator was that created this world and how it relates to us. I think it relates to us like a story or a storyteller does to a story, like an artist does to a piece of art. Yes, we can learn stuff about God. We can see God throughout the world, throughout this artwork he's created, throughout the story he's placed us in. But he's not equal to the artwork. He's above in some ways. Transcendent is the world. Now, one of the interesting things you can think about as you think about what kind of being would create the world is that as intelligent and creative and amazing as human beings are, you and I, whoever designed us, whoever came up with us, must have been even more creative, intelligent. So sometimes we look at the fact that we make God in our own image, right? We understand ourselves and then we assume everything to be about God. And in some ways that's bad because God is not usually as grumpy as I am, at least not in my experience. But sometimes we think that's bad, that we somehow are projecting ourselves onto him. But there actually is a way in which that is good. When you look around the universe, the most advanced, complex, and maybe this is arguable, but in my opinion, the most advanced and complex creation that we see is ourselves. That there's something about us that's different. That doesn't mean that we can just destroy the earth because we're kings of the earth. What it means, though, is there's something sacred, there's something special about human life. And when you look at us, what we're doing is we're looking at the most advanced thing that whatever this divine being has created, at least what we can understand. And it takes something smarter and better, I think, to create something else, right? So a dog can't build a computer, but a person, a human being can. And so whatever it was that created us must have at least the attributes that we do, the positive attributes, the intelligence that we do, the creativity that we do. Could I even say the emotions that we do? Or is it better to not have emotions? It depends on whether you're singing on Sunday morning, right, Liz? And so sometimes we get nervous because it feels like we're making God in our own image, but the truth is it's actually not too far off logically because it would be hard for a rock to create a human. And so the thing that we can understand that would be most likely to create this world we see in is something like us, but way more big, powerful, smart, right? So it's not dumb for us to conceive of God in a personal sort of way. That's not saying, again, that he's up there, old man in the sky with a beard, 2 eyes and mouth and a nose. But it is saying that it's okay and it's intelligent and that it's logical to conceive of God as some sort of a personal being, not just an impersonal life force. So this is part of my journey that I go on, that first I have to say, well, is there a God? And then next I have to say, well, is that God more likely to be the kind of personal God that I've been raised to believe in? Or maybe is it smarter to think of God more like a force, like a substance, like air or water? And I always come back to, no, the kind of God that would create the world that we live in seems to be a more personal God. I'm going to pause it right there and say, do you have any questions? Any thoughts? That's the end of my personal versus impersonal. Push back on anything I said? Lost? Okay, well, I'm going to assume that quiet laughter doesn't mean you're lost. So let's go on to the next question, which is whether God is involved in our world or not. A funny thing happened in 2012. George Lucas sold the rights to Star Wars to Disney, and then he stepped away. He offered them some ideas about the next trilogy, and they did not take them. They said, this is not what the fans want. And so George Lucas had created this whole world, and then he stepped away from it. It now runs itself. Well, Disney runs it, but he doesn't need to run it anymore. He doesn't need to intervene. He doesn't need to write the plot lines. The Star Wars world continues to exist, continues to thrive without his involvement. And that is how some people understand how the divine being relates to the world. So some people understand there to be a personal God who created the world, who used volition and reason and intelligence and creativity and free will to create the world, but then he chose to step back. And he's not involved, and he's not connected to the world anymore. He just kind of left us on our own. And that view is called deism. This is the view that God created natural laws that govern the universe, and he doesn't intervene. No miracles, no supernatural divine revelation, no need for his continued sustenance. He just created it. It was good enough, and he stepped back and let it run. So that's deism. Deism has huge implications for our lives, and it's actually kind of attractive in some ways. Basically, we're on our own. There's no personal calling then from God. There's no right religion. There's no overarching purpose in our lives except what we make of it. And maybe best of all, there are no expectations. We're free to do what we want, right? Without these divinely imposed commandments, religion, or calling. We just do our best to follow our conscience, follow reason, and that's our job. Now, I find the whole idea of a God who would create the earth and then step back harder to grasp personally, because I don't understand what the motivation to create the world would be in the first place if God wasn't going to continue to be involved in it, okay? So why create a universe at all if you're just going to create it and then kind of stand back and leave it? Why create human life if you're not going to be involved? Was it just like a rainy day in the universe? He was bored, kind of like a big Lego project. He said, well, today I think I'll create an earth and this species called humans, and we'll see what happens. But then he got tired, or maybe he got bored, moved on to other things, or maybe he's too busy creating new worlds and universes to give us attention. I just don't understand the motivation, why God would create something and then step away from it. I think all of us as humans can relate to reasons like that. We often start things and then abandon them. I probably have about 12 projects around my house that I started and stopped. And we have lots of reasons for that. We do get bored. We do get busy. We do get tired. We do need to move on. But God has unlimited power, time, attention. We can assume that if he's interested in something, say interested in a universe enough to create it, that he will continue to be interested in it because God by nature is outside of time and unchanging. He doesn't get bored. And if he's interested in it, then it seems to imply to me that he would be involved in it, since he is the creator. Now, this idea of a personal God who is involved and interested in the world is called theism. So deism says God is personal but uninvolved. Theism says God is personal and involved and interested. And so if God is interested and involved in this universe, and he has unlimited, infinite power and attention, that means he can give his full attention and be fully involved in every minute detail of it. So what that means is that similarly to pantheism, he is present in that sunset and in the loving human relationships because he's everywhere. He's completely involved. And he's also present with the child starving in Africa, and he's present with the murderer, but he's not necessarily equal to or approving of those things. And so what we're talking about here is transcendent, a God who's above and outside of our universe, but immanent, a God who is very much present and close to everything in the universe because he's infinite and he can do that. There's no such thing as a divided attention when you have an infinite amount of it. So, does that make sense, by the way? It's like just a little bit different from that whole idea of a oneness. A theistic God is present in, but separate from creation. And what that means, whether we like it or not, is that if God is personal and involved, that means he is 100% involved and interested in all of our lives, in your life and in mine. If that's the kind of God we have, it's either all or nothing. He's either 100% completely interested, always there, always involved in our lives, or he kind of flits in and out. Well, that's a God who doesn't have unlimited attention. That's a God who's finite somehow. Does that make sense? So, what's that? Yes? Yes.
So why does the Bible begin off as only and then
Well, that's a good question, but that's a Bible question.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So Kim asked, why does it begin with him having one chosen people? Well, the short answer is that he chose those people so all would be chosen. Not exclusively chosen, like nobody else, I don't like anybody else, but chosen to tell other people about him. So kind of the same way that we're chosen now. It's not like we're chosen because he unchose everyone else, but he's like, I've got a purpose for you. I've called you and I'm going to use you. Chosen in that regard. So that's the short answer. So let me go back to the idea of a theistic God. 55% of the population of the world today believe in a theistic God, a God who is personal and involved. That means Christians, Muslims, Jews. And I think the reason that the majority of people see God in this way is because most of us have some sort of experience of God, where it seems like God is involved in our life or in our world, or we've heard a story. And so my question for you today is, do you have an experience like that? Do you have some experience over the course of your life, one time maybe, where there was something that seemed like God had intervened somehow, that maybe it was a coincidence that was more than a coincidence. Maybe it was an answered prayer or something that seemed miraculous and you had no way of describing it. Here we're moving out of the realm of objective reasoning and we're moving into subjective. Is there some time in your life where it just seemed to you that there was a God who noticed you and was doing something and intervening somehow? For me, when I reason through whether it still makes sense to believe in a creator, and I go past this idea of, I do think that it makes sense to believe in a God, and I think it makes sense to believe in a personal God. And when I get to the idea of whether God's involved or not, or whether he's just standing off at a distance watching us, it sounds like a good song. Let's all sing it in our heads. He's watching us from a distance. Anyway, the point is that when it comes time to decide whether he's personal or not, I look back over my life and I see this series of experiences where it seems like God has reached into my life and done certain things. I was at the Chamber of Commerce event this week and I had a couple people ask why I came to Huntsville, why I started the church. And there's really only one story for that, and that's because I felt like God kind of told me to. I was here as a tourist in 2005 and just visiting my grandparents who lived up north of here, and was at the Algonquin Theater when I had this thing that I thought was kind of a vision from God. Like this totally subjective, but sort of in my head, vivid idea that God wanted us to come here and plant a church. And so I took that back to where we were living in Virginia, and we prayed and prayed and prayed. God, was that real, or was that just like some figment of my imagination? Do you want us to go? Because if you want us to, you need to make it a little more clear than that. And so we prayed and prayed, and then after months of praying about Huntsville, I was up in the mountains of Virginia one day, and I just randomly met a couple from Huntsville who affirmed my vision to come here and start a church. Now, I hadn't talked to anyone all day. That was solitude, which is something I like. And I was actually kind of annoyed when they struck up a conversation. But I had Canadian flags on my Jeep when I lived down there, and so that's why they started the conversation. But they could have been from anywhere in Ontario or anywhere in Canada. And the chances of them crossing my path when I hadn't talked to anyone and being right from Huntsville, it would actually be a little bit foolish for me to just go, oh, what a weird coincidence. It actually makes more sense to think that there was some sort of divine being who was kind of orchestrating the whole thing. That's actually the more logical explanation. And so I don't know if you have something like that, but when I struggle with doubt and when I go, is God personal, I can go back to an experience like that and say, I don't know how to explain that otherwise, other than to say there's a God who sometimes intervenes. I may not understand a lot, but it sure seems like he does stuff. And I hope that maybe you have something like that. And if not, I hope maybe God will give that to you. It's a tremendous gift. If you've been journeying with us in the process of buying our new building, I hope that you've seen God's hand in that. I hope that you'll be able to tuck this little experience of, I used to go to this church. I don't mean that you're leaving the church. You moved away in this scenario. Okay. And we needed a building, and we couldn't afford it, and there was no way we were going to be able to buy a building. And then God just did miracle after miracle and opened the doors for us to buy a building. There must be something out there that's interested in us. So our subjective experiences do a lot to help us know that God is not just this distant force, but perhaps is a person who's interested in our lives. And if God is infinite and eternal and he's interested in our lives, that means he's completely taken with us. He's completely interested in our lives. There's no half efforts with God. And so that's where I come to, and that's how far we are on our journey now, at least on my journey. I hope it's helpful for you. There's no proof here. There won't be any proof any week. But this is how I go through in my mind, does it still make sense to believe, and especially since I'm a pastor, does it still make sense to give my life to this and to ask other people to do that as well? So there'll be more steps in our journey, because at this point, we're just theists. We haven't addressed anything about Christianity or the Bible, and those are pretty big steps to take. And so we'll keep moving with those in coming weeks. But that's as far as I have for you now. Any questions? Okay, let's pray. God, I don't know if this is helpful for anyone else. It's kind of hard when I'm not, I don't have any basis of authority like the Scriptures. I'm just kind of sharing my own experience. But from my own experience, I just want to say thank you that despite the fact that you have proved yourself to me again and again, you're patient with my doubts. You're patient when I have to go through this journey, and that you're kind and loving enough that you understand, that you're not upset or angry, that your feelings aren't hurt because I doubt, that you just understand that I'm human. And so for those here who are wrestling with doubt or trying to figure out what they believe, God, I pray that you would make yourself clear to them in the ways that you have to me so many times. And God, answer questions or give peace, because I know you don't always answer our questions. And may the coming weeks be helpful. As we go out from this place, God, go with us. Allow us to spread your love wherever we go. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next week where we will continue this intellectual journey.